You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is author, journalist, Evan Thomas. He has written several books. I've read not all of them, but I've read most of them. Forgive me, Mr. Thomas. We are going to discuss today what I believe is the best one-volume biography of Richard Nixon I've ever read. And there are some good ones for sure, but this is at the top. Being Nixon, a Man Divided. Mr. Thomas, you may have seen him on television back in the days when there was reasonable conversations on the tube. He is famous for his work with Newsweek and with Time. He also appeared on Charlie Rose, Meet the Press, and various other shows, usually with the voice of reason, but also he brought a wonderful historical perspective. And I remember listening to his commentary on PBS, and he brings that to this book. It's an extraordinarily fair book about the 37th president, and I'm going to ask him about some of that. Mr. Thomas, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Robert, thanks for having me.
We are, as I like to say, a fan of subtitles here, the Leaders and Legends podcast. Your subtitle is A Man Divided. How or why was Richard Nixon divided?
There's a cartoon of Nixon as the wicked Nixon, the bad guy, the ultimate bad guy in politics in an earlier era, and who's scheming and plotting and trying to wreck the Constitution and kill all his enemies. But there was another side of Nixon that was very much, sometimes the dominant side, and that was of a public servant who wanted to do good, who really did, who had an optimistic view, wished to be optimistic. I was very struck, but it was a struggle. I was very struck by a scene that his daughter Julie relates, that when Richard Nixon came home at night in New York, when the kids were little, he turned on all the lights and he put up show tunes on the record player. And he'd want to brighten things up. He'd want to have cheerful conversation. Now, you could say that's because he was full of doom and gloom and he was trying to overcome it. And I guess that's true. But the fact is, he wanted to be an upbeat person. He would write this down. We have his notes of his, not quite diaries, but some notes that he left in his desk where he talks about wanting to be positive and upbeat. And that's the person he wished to be. Now, that's not always the person he could be, but it is a person he wished to be. And he accomplished, and the other piece of this, as we forget, is how much he accomplished. For one thing, he was an incredibly good politician. This is one of the great ironies. Somebody who was so personally insecure and really not all that good with people, you might say. He was on 5 national tickets. He was elected 4 times. He won in the greatest landslide in history as president, except for Lyndon Johnson beat him by, I think, 1/10 of a point. He was an enormously successful politician. And yet, you always have to say, and yet, ultimately, he brought himself down. But before he brought himself down, look at what he accomplished. Here he is, a conservative Republican, but he establishes the Environmental Protection Agency. He lowers voting age to 18. He does a lot of just making government work in a way that seems almost quaint today. On foreign policy, yeah, I guess it took him too long to get out of Vietnam, but I wonder if anybody else would have gotten out any faster. He inherited this problem, and he had a very sophisticated worldview, understanding that, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in this dance, potentially a death dance, but it didn't have to be that way if you had a sort of a better, more of a great power view. And he balanced off Russia against China. That was an incredible stroke of genius, really, going to China, opening up China, something that only he could have done. So he was, in many ways, he restored the NATO alliance. He was a very effective leader, in spite of his terrible demons.
You mentioned his list, and I said I had dog-eared a page in your book. It's page 246, and it was just about his 1-year anniversary of being inaugurated. He vowed to redouble, these are your words, but then he vowed to redouble his efforts to be an upbeat, communicative, sociable, fun-loving, all-American president. Need, work hard, treatment of staff, White House social events, bold, gutsy initiatives, telephone calls, music plus football. Can't have one without the other. And you wrote this, and I thought it was fascinating. Nixon was never going to reconcile the man he wished to be with the man he feared he was. Alone at night with his yellow pad, he could imagine and yearn for a leader who was tough but compassionate, bold but wise, firm but gentle. And this is the reason that I saved this particular page, is because of the division and how you describe him, a man divided.
Yeah.
In company, overwhelmed by social anxiety, he could sometimes not speak at all. He would spin his hands, helpless to articulate his eager, almost boyish idealism.
You don't think of Richard Nixon as an idealist. You think of him as a cynic. And sure, he could be cynical, and he played some cynical politics, but he was tremendously idealistic about our country. Well, one thing that people forget about him, he's running as a conservative Republican, California. This is way back, He's running for Congress, and he's running as a conservative Republican. Most people in his district just want America to come home. We've won World War II. We're sick of war and engagement, and we just want to come home and live as Averell Harriman used to say, most Americans just want to go to the movies and drink Coke in 1946. And I get that, and he got that, but he's an internationalist. He says, no, actually, we can't come home. We have to be in the world, and we have to, if not prop up the world, we have to feed the world. We have to open up the world markets. We have to stand up to communism. We have to be in Europe. All these places, he's a guy running for office. If he wants to run for office, he'd run as an isolationist, but he doesn't. He runs as an internationalist, somebody who wants to create a world system using American power, but to keep us open, the world open and free. The results of that have been magnificent for Americans, for sure, but for the rest of the world too, where we may be ending this era. We may be, but it was a hell of a run from 1945 to the president. And Nixon, if he was just a cynical right-wing politician, he would have been against all that. No, he was for it. He was part of the creation of it.
You mentioned a few minutes ago, and we were talking about the things that he accomplished. I will not say which year you were born, but you came of age. When Bob Dole did his eulogy of Richard Nixon in 94, he called the last half of the 20th century the age of Nixon.
Yeah.
You grew up, you came of age, went to college and everything in the age of Nixon. How did that experience influence how you wrote this book?
Very much. How to put this? I'm the sort of person that Richard Nixon was against.
Ivy League.
Yeah, I'm what drove Nixon crazy. I went to Harvard. He hated Harvard. There are very funny stories about he once heard that the president of Harvard was in the White House. Get him out! Get him out!
A couple of days ago, actually, earlier this, it won't be a couple of days when this is recorded, but earlier in October, I had breakfast with a good friend of mine, and his name is John Ruckelshaus. And he
Yeah,
is the nephew of William Ruckelshaus. And he
yeah.
talked about the whole Ivy League. I told him that you were coming on the podcast, and he was like, God, Nixon hated everyone in the Ivy League. He goes, but then you look at his advisors, and they were basically, so many of them
Yeah.
were from the Ivy League.
Yes, the ironies abound with Nixon. Of course, they do. He had a love-hate relationship, you might say, with the Ivy League. He did. He thought they were snobs, and a lot of them were, and he felt their resentment, and he was right to feel their resentment. But he also looked for talent, and if there was talent to be had in the Ivy League, he was going to bring it in. Now he was in the end, it crossed him up. We can get to that. High making Elliot Richardson Attorney General was maybe not good for his ultimate out. But look, he hires Henry Kissinger, a Harvard professor, as his national security advisor, and they do brilliant things together. Ruckelshaus on the environment. That was all to the good. He struggled with his own dislike of the Ivy League, but he hired Ivy Leaguers if he thought they could be good for the country.
One of the first biographies of Nixon I read, and this was, gosh, maybe 20 years ago, and it was written by someone I'm sure you knew. It's Tom Wicker.
Yeah, I know.
One of us. Was and obviously going into it, I was ignorant of the whole Franklin Orthogonian divide or whatever.
Yeah.
Is that a valid? And you talk about it, and you write about it in your book. How valid is that divide between that, not the haves and the have-nots, but the ins and the outs towards the development of Nixon's psyche?
Oh, I think it's important. You can make too much of somebody's college career, but I like to say that all life is high school, and by that it's the high school cafeteria with there's always the in crowd or the mean girls, and there's always the attention seeker and the clown, and there's always the nerds sitting off of the nerds who are basically going to be working for.
Let's hope.
Yeah, the revenge of the nerds. So it's a cliche, but like most cliches, it's true. Cliches are cliches because they're true. And this is one where Nixon gets to college and he's a socially awkward kid and he sees that there's a cool guy fraternity club, the Franklins, and has the sort of brilliant idea of setting up a counter fraternity it's politically smart. If you're going after, if you take a football team, you can get all the stars and the running backs, but there are more linemen than there are running backs. There are more nerds or more regular guys or just ordinary students than there are cool guys. So there are more votes. If you're running for student body president, it's sometimes good to run against the cool guys. There are fewer of them. And sure enough, Nixon, by aligning himself with the outs, with the not cool guys, there are more of them. And he won overwhelmingly student body president. The great thing, the insight he had, this is funny, but it's also very revealing. He ran on a ticket when he was running for student body president. His ticket was bringing dancing to Whittier. Now, what was that all about? Richard Nixon couldn't dance. He didn't like dancing, but he understood that in that era, Whittier is a very conservative religious school, doesn't want to have dancing, and so there's no dancing. But okay, so what do kids do? The rich kids, they have cars. They can drive into LA and go to nightclubs and go dancing. The poor kids, no. So by being in favor of bringing dancing, it's really running for a candidacy that favors the outs, bringing dancing to Whittier, or something that poor kids, the regular kids, and I should say in Depression era Whittier, a lot of poor kids. They don't have
Absolutely.
that. He wins overwhelmingly on that ticket. It foreshadows
The great silent.
the silent majority. It really does.
Is there an explanation for Nixon's behavior when he interacts with other people? Is it rooted? You mentioned his parents quite a bit. Is it rooted in the fact that he thought he was ugly, that he wasn't popular, that he was poor? He obviously was a phenomenally hard worker all through his life, starting as a kid. But when you look at what happens, let's just say Watergate or just his behavior during the presidency, can you say, aha, see what happened in 1940, whatever is directly connected to what happened in June of 72?
Broadly speaking, yes, that's true of you and me too. Our lives are dictated to some degree by our childhood. That's not an excuse. You can't blame your childhood for your problems, but you'd be a fool if you didn't think that your actions today are affected by the way you grew up and how your parents treated you and what you did at school. Of course it does. Again, not an excuse, but it's just real life. And Nixon was shy and awkward, and he tried to compensate. Now, he was brilliant about how he did it. You can make fun of it, but he's standing there on the steps of school handing out pieces of chewing gum, like buying votes when he's in 10th grade. So I'm making fun of it, but I admire it, really. He's compensating for his lack of social graces by reaching out to people. One thing that I thought was just brilliant, I experienced this firsthand. This is my introduction to Richard Nixon. I'm at Newsweek magazine. I'm an editor there. It's in the late 1980s, and Richard Nixon's doing a drop by, and we're interested in this, and so we're standing there. He comes over to me, and he says to me, "Your grandfather," he says, "was a great man." And I'm going, "What?" Now, just so your readers understand,
Sure.
my grandfather was Norman Thomas, who was a socialist leader. He ran for president 6 times on the socialist ticket in the first half of the 20th century. And here's the thing. Nixon had gotten the guest list, studied it, looked people up, and done his homework so that he knew who was going to be there. Now, this is just a drop by at Newsweek. Who cares? Most people they'd forget they were even doing it that day. They would walk in, shake some hands, say hi, leave. Now, Nixon. Nixon hasn't been in office for years, but Nixon prepares. He gets the list. He studies it. He does some research so that he can come over and compliment me, make me feel good. And he did. I felt flattered that this famous man knew who my grandfather was and complimented him. It was a little tiny stroke. He did this all day long. This is a nothing moment for him. But for me, it was significant. And it was revealing because he did this all his life. He would keep these index cards, writing down the names of precinct leaders, congressmen, businessmen, the names of their wives, their kids, what they did, and he would study and remember. And when he saw them, he would be able to engage. How's Joey doing? Does he like Colgate? I don't know. He was brilliant, and that can win you a lot of votes.
But with staff, he was famously distant. I think it's H.R. Haldeman, his
Yeah,
chief of staff, said, he goes, I don't even think the president knows the name of my kids.
yeah, I know. I find that weird and upsetting. Haldeman, we got to know my wife Osie's went to school with Susie Haldeman, and so we
Mm.
got to know the Haldeman family and got to know Mrs. Haldeman. And I found that bizarre that for instance, when they're up at Camp David, the presidential retreat up in the mountains here, and Haldeman, the chief of staff, would bring his family up, his kids, but when the Nixons arrived, he said, "Get out of the pool, get out of the pool. Don't even be in the swimming pool when they're arriving." Now, maybe he was being overcautious and not wanting to interfere with Nixon's privacy, but it's a little weird that their families didn't mix at all. I don't really have a great answer to that, except that Nixon was so private and was so shy, and I guess Haldeman wanted to respect that. It damn near ruined the Haldeman family because poor Joe, his wife, never saw her husband. He was,
Yeah.
Nixon. This is before emails, and so they lived on the phone. There was literally always a phone near Haldeman, and Nixon didn't sleep. So
All
he's calling
right.
the chief of staff all night long. It damn near ruined the Haldeman marriage. They restored their marriage wonderfully, but when you were working for Nixon, you were married to him. But as you say, not in a warm way, in a kind of a cold way.
You read biographies of Ronald Reagan, and we've had several Reagan historians on the podcast, and they talk about the comment that James Baker made, and obviously Mr. Baker, former Secretary of State, former Secretary of the Treasury, Chief of
Yeah.
Staff for the White House, said that President Reagan treated us all the same. like hired help. And I asked Mitch Daniels that about that because Mitch Daniels worked in the Reagan White House.
Yeah.
And he says he laughed and he goes, I know exactly what Jim's trying to say. There is that distance
Yeah.
that Nixon seemed to have with the members of his inner circle, except for John Mitchell. And
Yeah.
and what comes through in your book is and I read James Rosen's book
Hmm.
on Mitchell, and I'm actually going to reach out to Mr. Rosen and try to get him on the podcast because I loved that book.
Yeah, you should. He's writing a biography of a Scalia right now.
Oh, okay.
President.
And thank you. Mitchell was different. Why was Mitchell different? And how did Nixon's attitude towards Mitchell influence the direction of Watergate?
Why was Mitchell different? Mitchell was a father figure to Nixon, just so people know who he was. When Nixon is out making a little money in the 60s as a lawyer in New York, he goes to a firm called Mudge Rose. And the kind of lead partner was Mitchell. Mitchell was a bond lawyer. And they become close working at this law firm. And it was important politically because as a bond lawyer, he knows a lot of local politicians. Lawyers work on the bond issuances. Mitchell knew damn near every Republican office holder because he was selling bonds for their cities and states. And so there's a political entree, but he was Nixon thought that Mitchell was wise, a wise man type. And I guess Mitchell in his own way was, but Mitchell had an unfortunate wife.
That's a generous description.
And she was drunk and talked too much to reporters. And Mitchell loved her, but she just drove him crazy. And now, how does this affect Watergate? This is a bit of a winding tale, but Mitchell is, after he stops being attorney general, he runs a committee to reelect the president. And that's where the trouble starts on Watergate. They're the people who are up to no good, breaking into the Watergate and the plumbers and all. That's all being run out of the committee to reelect the president, not the White House, but the committee to reelect. And Nixon's not really paying attention, but neither is Mitchell. Mitchell is distracted by his wife, who's got all these terrible drinking problems and emotional problems. Mitchell is just not paying attention. And when the Watergate break-in happens, and it's quickly traced back to the committee to reelect the president, what should Nixon have done? He should have fired Mitchell right away. And that might have stopped it. That might have ended it. But he couldn't bear to do it. There was one of the things about Nixon, who we think of as this hard-ass guy, he was a softie. He really had trouble firing people and saying no. He usually had other people do that for him. And he just could not bring himself to fire or even to blame Mitchell. Or to understand that Mitchell was distracted and really fallen down on his job. And that festered his unwillingness to take care of business in the summer of 1972. A couple of years later, Nixon loses his own job because he couldn't get control. Had he just fired Mitchell and cleaned house when the break-in happened, because Nixon himself did not know about the break-in.
That's exactly right.
People don't realize this. Nixon did not know about it. It happened on his watch. He's the responsible officer, but he didn't know about it. If he had taken charge, fired people, including his buddy Mitchell, he would have beaten George McGovern easily, been a two-term president. The rest is history. But he didn't. Instead, he's part of a cover-up. And partly it's to protect Mitchell. He can never confront Mitchell, but it's poignant. He feels sorry for Mitchell. High cost of that.
It's been a while, but I did a podcast interview and we were talking about social media, and they asked me if I could, who in the past would you wish was on Twitter? It was Twitter at the time. And I chuckled and I remember saying someone that's so far left, so out of left field, you'd never think about it. And they said, whom? And I said, Martha Mitchell.
Yeah.
If Martha Mitchell had been on Twitter, the entire shape of this country would have been completely different. You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is New York Times bestselling author Evan Thomas. We are discussing his biography, Being Nixon, A Man Divided. For someone who was so awkward, which I think is a generous yet fair description of Richard Nixon, he seemed to have a lot of believers, a lot of boosters. What do you think starting and he runs, is it 46, 48, 46, which is his first,
46 for Congress,
and
and
then
a
50
couple
for
of terms,
Senate?
and then
Yeah.
50 for Senate.
Yeah. What is it that people saw in this man? Because he sure did have a legion of people who said, "You can do it, Dick. We're behind you, Dick."
He tapped into something that is highly relevant to this moment, and that is what's known as the forgotten man. And this may be an FDR phrase. I forget where the word the forgotten man comes from, but it's been around in politics for a long time. This idea that there are elites, and the elites look after themselves, and the fix is in for the elites, and they take care of themselves. And then there's the forgotten man, everybody else. And there are, and they resent it, rightfully, and they suspect that the elites really don't have their interests at heart. They have the interests of the elite at heart. The bankers, the lawyers, Hollywood, Harvard, the universities, the East Coast establishment. Call it what you may, but it's vaguely them, the elites, versus
Them.
them versus us, the people. And Nixon was brilliant about tapping into the us, to the people, to the forgotten man, to this. He did coin this term, the silent majority, who this the context was Vietnam. Think of it, the protesters at Harvard and the colleges are going crazy, and the liberals are going crazy, and they're anti-patriotic, and they want to bring America down. And Nixon appeals to this silent majority that's not out there demonstrating, they're not noisy, but they want to support America. And he makes it a kind of a, do you believe in America or not kind of thing. Now, leaving aside the question of whether we should have been in Vietnam in the first place or should we have gotten out of it, Nixon cleverly twists it around so that it's a us and them sort of thing. And the us are patriotic Americans who believe in their country. Uh, this has all sorts of echoes for today, obviously, MAGA. But it's an ancient force in American life. There are populists back into the turn of the in
Right.
the 19th century. Charles Evan Hughes, was it?
Andrew Jackson.
And yeah, Andrew Jackson. You can go back, really, you can go back to Hamilton and Jefferson. And there's this divide between the common man and the elites. This goes all the way back to our very beginning.
The
And
sans culottes in the French Revolution.
absolutely. And resentment is a powerful thing, and people resent people who think they're better than you. Look at J.D. Vance. He's tapped into this. It's a real thing, and the elites are unbelievably stupid and self-defeating by being haughty and proud and contemptuous and calling everybody else. How stupid is that? Cost her the election, cost Hillary Clinton the election. So there's nothing new, but it's pretty prominent right now.
And you wrote this book, came out in, I believe, 2015. What would 1971 Evan Thomas think about what he wrote about Nixon in 2015?
Well, that's a good question. 1971, Evan Thomas was a jerk. I was an elitist. I was a Harvard sophomore or junior then. I was 20 years old and I was a jerk. I was part of my environment. Now, I may be overstating it a little bit. I hope I'd be a little more self-aware than that. Maybe I would have been, but I wouldn't count on it. I was 20 years old. What the hell did I know?
Well,
Uh,
you certainly came of age during the greatest music period in the history of the world.
I did, but I missed it. I was such a jerk that I half missed it. I wasn't that into it. I listen to all that stuff. I love it. But at the time, I missed it because I was, what was I? I was a little bit caught in the middle. I wasn't a peacenik radical. I had a high draft. This is embarrassing. I had a high draft number. I wasn't going to Vietnam. So I didn't have to really worry about that.
I've talked to several people who have said that's the defining moment in their life is their draft number. And back when Bill Clinton was running for president in 92 and he said he didn't remember his draft number. I just remember I got out of the army in 90 and 92. I was starting college. All the commentary was everybody remembers their draft number because it was going to dictate the rest of their lives. And Nixon's ending of the draft was a
Yeah,
huge
you.
deflator.
Oh my God. I lived this. When I arrived at college in 1969, we were burning the place down. Not we, but my classmates were burning the place down because I didn't want to go to Vietnam. It was war avoidance. I'm ashamed of all this, to tell you the truth. we were avoiding the draft so that poor people, poor black kids, people whose parents worked at a gas station, they were going to Vietnam to get killed. We were all getting deferments, squash elbow. We were getting out of it. So I'm ashamed of this, but that was the atmosphere. Then Nixon ends the draft. By the time I'm a junior or senior, it's over. This is what Kingman Brewster, the president of Yale, called an
Yeah.
eerie tranquility settled over the campus. Because once that draft was gone, who cares? We're not going to war. And it's back to drinking beer and smoking pot.
Nixon becomes a congressman in 1946. He defeats Jerry Voorhees, I think was his opponent. It's during this time that the ultimate reference or reflection point to me in Nixon's career takes place, and that is his battle with Alger Hiss, perhaps the Pontifex Maximus of the Eastern establishment.
Yeah.
How did Nixon's ultimately successful combat with Alger Hiss change his career?
It vaulted him into the headlines. This is just the background. Alger Hiss is a State Department guy, and he is being accused of being a communist agent by a guy named Whittaker Chambers, who's a Time magazine, former Time magazine writer. And Alger Hiss is proud and he's good looking and he went to Harvard Law School and he has the establishment on his side. And he says, I'm innocent. And Nixon just smelled on Hiss that he was not innocent, partly because Hiss was condescending to people like Nixon.
You went to Whittier, right?
Yeah, yes, that's a phrase. The Nixon is, what's your college? Hiss says Harvard, and Hiss contemptuously says to Nixon, you went to Whittier?
The Caddyshack moment where
Yeah, sure.
he says Harvard, we're St. Copious of.
Sure. And so it pisses Nixon off, and Nixon's going to get him. And he does his homework and finds out that actually Alger Hiss is a Soviet spy or was a Soviet spy. And he catches him. It's a long and tangled tale about how he did it. It rivets the country because it is exciting how they finally catch him. And everything is, all life is timing. And the timing is perfect here because Americans have won World War II and they want peace and prosperity, but whoops, Russia has just blown up an atom bomb. And oh my God, we're now facing this in this existential struggle against Soviet communism, and somebody must be to blame for that. Whose fault is that? It's those damn spies, especially that spy who went to Harvard, Alger Hiss. So Nixon's timing is perfect. He catches a moment when the public is scared and ready to be really mad, and Nixon plays it for all it's worth and rides that wave into national prominence.
He also came of age when, surprisingly, because he certainly, I wouldn't call a particularly handsome man, but he comes into the age of politics when the age of television is growing at the same time. Yeah. How did he famously in the Chequers speech saved his career or saved his slot on Eisenhower's ticket in 52. 1960, he loses, for lack of a better term, that debate against John F. Kennedy, the first debate. Everyone on the radio thought he won, or majority on the radio thought he won, but watching him, how did Nixon, what did he think of television? How did he use it?
It's such an interesting story because, as you mentioned, he had one of the worst moments on TV ever. His debate against JFK, it's an even race. And in the first debate, some people are my age will remember this. The rest of your listeners have at least heard about it. JFK looks like JFK. He looks great. He got tan. And poor Nixon got his 5 o'clock shadow and he's smeared on some stuff that's supposed to cover it up. He's sweating. Yeah, he just looks terrible. And
he was sick.
He was sick. Yeah, he had a fever. So he just looks awful. And whatever he says doesn't really matter. He just looks so bad. So TV, live by the sword, die by the sword. He's really killed by TV. But as you also mentioned, he had used TV earlier when Eisenhower was getting ready to throw him off the ticket in 1952 because there was a little scandal over a slush fund. It was a bogus scandal. It was really not fair to Nixon, but he was about to be jettisoned by the president. And Nixon went on national TV and gave his famous Chequers speech. A lot of people thought that was kind of maudlin. and talking about his dog, his little kid's dog Checkers, and how they weren't going to give it back.
A lot of voters have dogs.
But a lot of voters have dogs. It was very effective. And I love the scene where the President Eisenhower is watching the speech, and his buddies are all saying, "Oh, how maudlin and yucky is this?" And he looks over to Mrs. Eisenhower, and she's crying. And he realizes, oh, wait a second, this speech worked. And so Nixon saves himself by using TV in 1952. Now, in 1960, TV kills him, really, or arguably, there's a lot of academic
Sure.
about this, but, arguably kills him. Okay, so Nixon is a learner. He learns from his mistakes. And he meets a guy named Roger Ailes, who at that time is just a booking, I think it was the Merv Griffin show, very obscure. But Nixon, with his eye for talent, he could spot those smart Harvard guys, but he could also spot Roger Ailes. And he hires him as a media consultant in 68 for the 68 campaign. And Ailes really understands how to get the poor, the dispossessed, the forgotten people, the silent majority. He understands how to reach out to those people. So this is the same guy who created Fox News, right? The greatest genius there has ever been about creating a whole brand that runs against the liberal media. This is what Ailes did later in life, but in 1968, he's just an obscure guy. Nixon hires him, and they very cleverly create these TV shows where Nixon is asked tough questions. It's all staged in a way, but it's also not phony because these are tough questions. And Nixon is able to respond, and he brilliantly uses TV to win the 68 election. There's a book about all this, The Selling of the President.
Yeah, McGinnis.
Yeah, McGinnis. And that was really Roger Ailes, the early Roger Ailes' genius. The point is that Nixon had the genius to hire Roger Ailes and to use him. They later fell out, but no matter. Nixon was very clever about using TV, even though, as you say, he wasn't good on TV. If you work at it, if you learn, if you prepare, you can overcome. In fact, I would argue that the very fact that you're bad at it is the goad to make you good at it. One of the things about Nixon is a lesson for us all. If you're bad at something, work at it, overcome it. Don't just accept defeat. Don't be a victim. Overcome it.
One thing about Richard Nixon, he never accepted defeat. One of my favorite books is Ike and Dick by Jeffrey Frank. I'm going to make a guess that you two know each other. He actually came on the podcast to discuss
I know. Sure.
His book on President Truman, which was terrific.
Yep.
Richard Nixon and Dwight Eisenhower, just for a minute or two, please discuss their relationship, because I just simply can't think of two people more different on the same ticket.
Yeah, it was not a good mix. Eisenhower, unfairly, I got to set the scene here. Eisenhower's winning the nomination for the presidency in 1952. He's got to find a vice president. It's a cursory process. He doesn't spend a whole lot of time on it. It's a political thing. He needs California. Nixon is he needs conservatives. He needs California, he needs youth. Nixon's all that. He barely meets the guy. He's not impressed by him. I think they go fishing together on something in Colorado. And of course, Nixon gets he's not a good fisherman. The hook catches his collar or something like that.
Clumsy in general.
And Eisenhower just thinks Nixon's kind of an uncool guy and a bit of a sleazeball too. But Eisenhower's like an politician. He's a former general. He's above politics. And Nixon to him looks like a kind of standard issue sleazy pal. Unfairly. Eisenhower's judging him unfairly, but he is judging him. And so they're a bad mix. Eisenhower tries to throw him off the ticket in 52, reconsiders after the Checkers speech, but then he tries to throw him off the ticket again in 56. He says,
promoting him to Secretary of Defense.
And Nixon's not having any of this and just outlasts him, just refuses to go. And Eisenhower can't quite bring himself to just kick him off the ticket. But it's not good. Then, famously in 1960, poor Nixon, now running for president after 8 years of Eisenhower, and at a press conference in August, President Eisenhower is asked, "Can you tell us something that Richard Nixon did as vice president that really made a difference?" And Eisenhower says, well, if you give me a week, I'll think of something. I mean, what a brutal put down is that?
Right.
I don't
Yeah.
think it was really intentional. There's a thing Eisenhower was rattled, tired. But anyways, he said it. And it was hurtful to Nixon. Now, but here's the thing about it. You would think that Nixon would hate Eisenhower forever because he put him down. He robbed him of his dignity. Didn't
Right.
really help him get in the 60 election till the very end. But that's really not how Nixon works. Nixon made it his business to get along with Ike. After all, Nixon's daughter marries Ike's grandson. That helps. But
Yeah.
Nixon wants to get along with Eisenhower. And in 1968, Eisenhower is deathly ill now and dying of a heart condition. Kind of embraces Nixon. They do bury the hatchet.
I love that scene that you articulate in your book. And it's come through in the Ike and Dick book by Mr. Frank and others, where Eisenhower says, "This is the last time I'm calling you Dick."
Yeah.
This is after Nixon wins in 68.
Yeah.
Eisenhower dies in 69, so
Also,
not long.
yeah, actually forgot that scene, but that is a good scene. Yeah, Mr. President now.
I wonder what Nixon felt, how he felt to look at the five-star general, most popular person in the world, two-time elected president, and have him say, "From now on, you are Mr. President."
President. Wow, that's what Nixon was working for in a way all his life, that kind of respect and esteem. And Nixon gives a brilliant eulogy to Eisenhower when he dies in 69. He dies pretty soon after he's inaugurated of a heart condition. And Nixon talks in the eulogy about Eisenhower's qualities, and the quality that really gets him is that Eisenhower was confident enough to be humble. Think about that. Unpack that for a second. Somebody who's confident enough to be humble. This is a theme that I return to again and again when I'm thinking about people and wishing for myself. When we in life, people who are arrogant are often actually insecure. When you think about it, people who are show-offs or arrogant or carrying on about themselves, they're actually insecure. They're covering something up. Whereas people who are actually genuinely confident, I'm not talking about faking confident, people who are actually confident, like Mitch Daniels, they can be humble because they got nothing to prove and they know it goes better for you if you're humble. And that Eisenhower had that quality, the confidence to be humble. And Nixon talked about that in his eulogy for Eisenhower. Now, of course, the tragedy is Nixon could not be that way himself. He could never be confident enough to be humble. He was a show-off. He liked the pomp and circumstance. He just couldn't overcome his insecurities. It's so ironic and tragic. He appreciated these qualities in Eisenhower, but he just could not do it himself.
And if winning two terms, including in 1972, where he won every state but Massachusetts, I think it was 521 to 17 in the Electoral College, huge, the biggest landslide Electoral College, I guess if you don't count Washington and James Monroe, but also until Reagan came along with his 525-13 drubbing of Mondale in 84. If being elected twice as president of the United States isn't enough to overcome or counterbalance your insecurities, what could?
Yeah, what could? Nothing. The word profound that describes Nixon's insecurities. Because back to what we began with, you can unravel his childhood forever, but Nixon had a bullying father who was a jerk, and a mother who was quiet and pious, but also I think a little cold and withdrawn. And two of his brothers die. Nixon feels somehow survivor's guilt. And all these things add up to create this poor kid who has a hole in his heart that could never be filled.
And he can't go to Harvard. He gets accepted into Harvard,
Yeah,
correct?
yeah.
But he
of course,
can't
not enough
go
money.
because he
Yeah,
doesn't have enough money because
not
his
enough money.
brother's sick and they have to.
Yeah,
Let's
yeah.
talk about three elections very quick: 60, 62, and 66. So on a scale of 1 to 10, in the election of 1960, 1 being not at all, 10 being D.B. Cooper, How close was how would you rate the 1960 Nixon Kennedy election on the scale of being stolen?
I think it was stolen. I don't think we have final proof of this, but and in fact, I've heard somebody's even writing about this. In Chicago, Democrats spread around a lot of walking around money, and I think they did steal Chicago. Apparently, Daley admitted it in a phone call to Ben Bradley
With the help of a few friends.
with the help of a few friends. Yeah, so I think it was stolen. Nixon heroically doesn't. He starts to fight it, but then doesn't. And there he is. He's the vice president of the United States. He has to certify JFK's election. He does, and it's one of the things I love about American democracy. The loser certifies the person who beat him. You know, he didn't love JFK, but he certifies his election, and goes off into the sunset. This is what George Washington had in mind when he went back to his Mount Vernon to sit under the olive tree. The democracy goes on. We pass it on, and Nixon was able to do that. He was urged to fight it and to make more of an issue over religion and all that. He didn't. He resisted that impulse, and the government turned over.
Just like John C. Breckinridge in 1860, who is the sitting vice president. He's one of the four main candidates for president in 1860, along with Lincoln and Stephen Douglas and a guy named Bell, John Bell, I think. And Breckinridge is a sitting vice president for James Buchanan, and he has to certify his loss and Lincoln's win. And after his term as vice president is finished, John C. Breckinridge becomes a general in the Confederate Army.
Yeah.
If Breckinridge isn't going to destroy the democracy, he could have taken all the electoral votes and thrown them in the Potomac, or just taken him with him, his new country, for lack of a better term. But he didn't do that. And I used to work for Mike Pence, and he's come on the podcast. He's a very close friend, and I think the world of him. And he and I have talked about that, where if a soon-to-be Confederate general is going to honor the democratic process as we've defined it, then we should probably honor it.
Yeah, no. I mean, Pence brought enormous honor to himself in that moment.
1962, Nixon runs for governor of California. He gets thumped by Ed Brown.
Jerry Brown. No,
Jerry
not
Brown.
Pence's son. Edward Brown is the father. Right. Yeah.
Like something Brown, Edmund, whatever. But yes, he gets thumped. Nixon has his famous "You won't have me to kick around anymore" news conference. But Nixon's smart. He moves to New York City. He starts making the rounds, and he does something. I loved Pat Buchanan's book, both of them, actually, the one about the White House and the one about the greatest comeback. He campaigns for Republicans throughout the country in 1966. And it's a good year for Republicans, just coming off the 64 disaster. How did his campaigning in 66 set the stage for him to become the Republican nominee and president in 68?
Well, he's quietly picking up IOUs, of course, because when you campaign for somebody, they owe you. So he's picking up IOUs with elected officials. But he does a few things that are smart. One thing, he absents himself, let Rockefeller and Scranton and Romney, let them all knock each other off while he goes off and takes a kind of tour around the world, meeting statesmen and fattening his bona fides for a foreign policy president, and also learning about the world, Israel and all over. But he transitions to become a moderate. People don't really realize this. They like to complain about Nixon's Southern strategy in 1968, that he was playing the race card and was racist. And it's a lot more complicated than that.
The Cold War played a huge role in that.
Yeah, in 1968, but particularly to stick with this Southern strategy, the radical was George Wallace.
Yeah.
George Wallace, the big racist, was George Wallace. Nixon was looking for middle ground here, where he could be the reasonable one, the rational one, not the crazy racist, but restore the country to some level of order, because 68, the country feels like it's blowing up, and you've got crazies on the left and crazies on the right. Nixon ran as a moderate. He ran down the middle. And yes, there was some subtle dog whistles to voters in the South. He did. That's true. but he wasn't nearly as crazy as Wallace was. And he won really because he could attract moderate voters, not just conservative voters. And he played that brilliantly. I thought it was the most. He said the most important speech he ever gave was a 30-minute speech at Bohemian Grove, which
Yeah.
is a camp for rich tycoons out in the West, out in California. Boy, that sure wouldn't happen today. But the point is he's appealing for the moderates, for the establishment, and he got their votes. That's how he won, not by running to the right, but by running to the middle.
I'm gonna again, excuse me, make a guess that you know Mark Lawrence and Mark Updegrove.
I know Mark Updegrove. I forgot Mark Lawrence. Remind me.
Uh, Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy down historian.
Yeah. Mark Updegrove I've worked with, but if I've met Mark Lawrence, I apologize. I don't remember.
They came on the podcast separate, and then they came on together because they're great friends. And I asked this question. I'll ask it of you. And one of them, if they didn't vapor lock, it was close. True or false? The United States in the last 64 years of history would have been better off had Nixon won in 1960. True or false?
I have to really think about that. I'm a Kennedy flunky, and I don't have a good answer to that. Maybe they had quick answers. I can't answer that. You stumped because I'm instinctively like Kennedy, and I thought his speech was great, and I think a lot of his presidency was good. And Nixon, there was a side of Nixon that could get you into war, which I feared a little bit. He could be a little too hawkish, and I wonder how he would have done in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, you might argue he wouldn't have had a Cuban Missile Crisis because Khrushchev wouldn't have done that, because Khrushchev wouldn't have beat up Nixon at the summit. Where was it?
Vienna.
So this is all kind of history counterfactual. So I can feel myself getting my feet tangled up, trying to work through it. I can't. You've stumped me. I don't have an answer to that question.
Have you read the book about Kennedy and Vietnam and whether he would have gone forward?
I know which book. I know about the debate, certainly. I think that, and I'm not sure what book you're referring to, but my general sense was that's another historical unknowable. Would he have gotten out? Kennedy was pretty political, and he was afraid of alienating conservatives and Southern conservatives, so he might not have. He didn't want to be tagged with losing Vietnam the way people have been tagged with losing China. So he may have gotten us in there. Also, his national security advisor, Mac Bundy, did get us in there
Right.
under Johnson. Maybe he would have done the same under Kennedy. The answer to that question, once again, is I don't know.
I do PR for a living, political PR especially, and that's not a bad answer at all. I can live with that. The book that I'm referring to is called The Kennedy Withdrawal. It's by Mark Silverstone, and it's Camelot and the American Commitment to Vietnam. I will send you the link to the podcast interview I did with him.
Okay.
It's terrific. The book is very fair.
What does it say?
That the Kennedy acolytes who say, "Oh my God, JFK would have never,"
Yeah.
that's just wishful thinking. That's
Yeah,
that's Camelot. That's not history.
Yeah, I agree with that.
1968. I'll ask you another question. He's passed now, but a guy named Mike Riley came on my podcast. Mike Riley was plucked, not out of obscurity, but pretty damn close, by the Kennedy family to run Robert Kennedy's campaign in Indiana in 1968. I'm a huge fan of the 1968 election. Actually, I think Jules Wickover book, The Year the Dream Died, is my favorite. 1968 politics and just the world and the country. But you have written a biography of RFK. I asked Mike Riley this, and his answer was predictable because he ran the campaign. Robert Kennedy survives in 68. Is he elected president in 68? And does Nixon have to face the Kennedy machine once again?
I'm a little bit of a contrarian on this. I know the conventional wisdom is that if Bobby hadn't been shot, he would have won. I was influenced by Fred Dutton. Fred Dutton was Bobby Kennedy's body man, I guess you would call him, travel with him, very smart political guy. And Dutton had a very negative view of this. He said, you got to remember that in 1968, The Democratic Party is still run by the machine, by state machines, by the unions and political bosses. And Humphrey had those people pretty well lined up. And they thought that Bobby was annoying. He was a difficult guy, too hot for TV. Bobby was not so good on TV.
Reagan thumped him in that, or cleaned
Yeah,
him up in that
he could
debate.
be very, he could be inarticulate, spacey, and then hot and angry. Really not great on TV. I was convinced by Dutton that no sure bet that Bobby would have even won the nomination. The theory is that Daley would have delivered it for him. Mayor Daley would have come through and delivered it. Maybe, but I don't think that's foregone by any means. I think Bobby might have lost the nomination. And even if he had won and run against Nixon, Nixon was scared of Bobby and scared of the Kennedys, and he might have blown it. But Bobby might have overplayed his hand and been too hot for the moment, and Nixon might have beaten him.
One of my all-time favorite books, and he came on Jeff Schiesel. I don't know if you know him.
Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
He wrote the book Mutual Contempt about the
Yeah.
relationship between Lyndon Johnson and Robert Kennedy. I just loved it.
Yeah,
Excellent book.
great book. Yeah.
And who do you think Lyndon Johnson would have voted for in '68? Robert Kennedy or Richard Nixon?
Nixon. Nixon.
And Mondale felt the same thing, felt the same way, that he wasn't sure if Lyndon Johnson really actually supported Humphrey,
Yeah.
let alone Richard Nixon.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that in some ways was more simpatico with Nixon on Vietnam. Nixon was sensitive to the plight that the country was in and the difficult spot that Johnson was in. And Johnson and Nixon, they had a lot in common. They'd been through the political
Yeah.
wars together. So there was some respect there.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is journalist and historian Evan Thomas. We're discussing his book, Being Nixon, A Man Divided. Vietnam was the rock, paper, and scissors of all issues, I would say, in the late 1960s. You could throw in the space race and civil rights and inflation or so on and so forth. But you mentioned a few minutes ago in our discussion that maybe Nixon took too long to get out of Vietnam. His secret plan was not put into place.
Yeah, there was no secret plan.
Exactly.
All bogus. There was no secret plan.
Exactly. It's like the missile gap. It's like it's made up so you can get elected.
Yeah.
So how would you grade Nixon's handling of the Vietnam War? The South Vietnamese were just, I won't prattle on too long, but it's fair to say that it was an unreliable army. It was a corrupt government. It was 10,000 miles away. What do you think Nixon could have done different? And do you give him high marks for some of the things he did do?
I'm sympathetic to him because it was such a difficult problem getting out of there. He wanted to use the Russians to lean on the North Vietnamese. That didn't work, or it didn't work very well. Kissinger was a great statesman in many ways, but he never really got the Russians to lean on the North Vietnamese. So he was in a very difficult position. He tried to use force and power. Kissinger told me that he regretted that in the first year they didn't come down hard on North Vietnam. They didn't bomb the hell out of them. That Nixon backed off from doing that because he was afraid of the anti-war movement. That in retrospect, they should have really bombed Hanoi right away. That's, again, a counterfactual. Would that have worked? I'm doubtful, to tell you the truth. The North Vietnamese were going to just tough it out one way or the other. There's no way that we were going to ever beat them, I think. So I think Nixon was in a very difficult position. He tacked, he turned, he tried this, he tried that. Nothing really worked until the very end of his first term, when they did bomb Hanoi and they did mine Haiphong harbors. And actually, the North Vietnamese moved a little bit at the negotiating table and allowed the preservation of the South Vietnamese government for a little while, a decent interval, as they say. So that bought a little moment when the United States could extricate itself. But look, it was a very temporary thing, because as soon as we got out, North Vietnam rolled in and crushed South Vietnam. So it was going to end badly one way or the other. I think it could have ended badly a little bit sooner. About half the Vietnamese war deaths, U.S. war deaths in Vietnam, happened on Nixon's watch. I believe that's about right.
That sounds right.
Well, I want to believe there was a way to get out of there faster, but I'm very sympathetic with the policymakers. You couldn't just get on boats and go home. That was not going to work. You had to try to have some kind of negotiated withdrawal, but you're negotiating with people who knew they were going to win anyway. So,
That's right.
very tough situation.
No Vietnam, or at least the way the Nixon administration approached it. No Vietnam equal no Watergate. How much of the foundation of Watergate, leaving aside Nixon's personality and the crazies, how much of Watergate and the way it was handled and why it even happened in June 17th, 1972, when they broke into the DNC, how much of that is influenced by Vietnam?
I think it is. I think Vietnam drove him crazy and it just made him nuts. There he is. The Pentagon Papers are leaked to the New York Times in 1971, and Nixon's just crazy about it. And that's how the plumbers get going. Nixon wants to break in, get Ellsberg psychiatrists. The madness begins with Nixon's fury over this is crazy. The Pentagon Papers weren't about Nixon. They were accusing the Democrats. Nixon was innocent, but Kissinger gets to Nixon and says, "Oh, you can't tolerate this. You got to do something." And Nixon goes crazy about it and the White House launches the plumbers to break into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. This is the first great crime. So that for sure. The other thing I think more subtle, but also very important, Kissinger was a great statesman in many ways, but he was a difficult guy. And H.R. Haldeman, the chief of staff, was initially going to let somebody else deal with Kissinger, but he can't help himself. They form something called the Henry Handling Committee, which is because Henry Kissinger is always threatening to quit, and they become obsessed with him. He's also leaking to the Washington Post. He's putting down Nixon. He's claiming credit for going to China when really that was Nixon's idea. And he's telling all this to Mrs. Graham and the Washington Post. Nixon's jealous. And they become obsessed with Kissinger. They put in the taping system, little known fact. That taping system
That's right.
in there, according to Haldeman, because Haldeman is Nixon are watching as Kissinger boasts about his foreign policy achievements to the Washington Post, and they want a record. They want to tape stuff so the world will know when I write my memoirs that it was me, not that Henry Kissinger who did the good stuff here. So this obsession with Kissinger takes their eye off of what's going on in the committee to reelect. And they just not paying attention to that the gremlins are over there. And we mentioned earlier, Mitchell is too busy worrying about his drunken wife. And it all gets out of control. And then they cover it up instead of exposing it. So in that sense, Vietnam, they're worried about Kissinger, who's negotiating Vietnam, distracts them so much that they let Watergate get out of control. Now, part of that is their own moral weakness that they didn't step up to it. You can fault them for that, but I'm not a Woodward and Bernstein who think it was this terrible constitutional crisis. I think it was a series of small errors that they bungled and brought them down.
John Chancellor, in my view, maybe yours as well, certainly overstated it. The greatest constitutional crisis in our nation's history. And you're just thinking,
I know that's
you don't remember Fort Sumter?
Woodward and Bernstein like to say this because it enhances their own role and makes them even greater heroes than they were. And they were heroes, but it makes them even greater heroes. I think it was mostly bumbling gang that couldn't shoot straight and then covering that up. It was a series of accidents and mistakes that led to his downfall, not ruining the Constitution.
What do you think of the movie Nixon with Anthony Hopkins?
Anthony Hopkins chewed all the scenery and he overwhelmed it. So I was disappointed by it. I think that Anthony Hopkins is a great actor, but it's a problem when you do these biopics because it becomes about the actor and who could play Nixon. Hopkins had a lot of great roles, but that wasn't one of them. And also Oliver Stone. Didn't Oliver Stone direct that?
Yes, sir.
He's overboard. He goes too far.
1968, you discuss this in your book, and it's alluded to in the movie Nixon and some subsequent literature, that that Richard Nixon and or his campaign coordinated in some way with a woman named Anna Chennault,
Oh, yeah.
who was friends with the South Vietnamese government. It's almost too complicated to get into.
Oh,
I've heard other people say, including Pat Buchanan, look, if it didn't take back channels to Anna Chennault for the South Vietnamese to realize that Nixon was going to be tough, like they should have known that
yeah,
already.
that is a key fact that I'm sorry to interrupt you here, but that is
No, please go ahead. That's the question I was going to ask you.
that gets, people say, oh my God, Nixon used this back channel to signal the South Vietnamese that they would do better by him. And so, it's a false premise. The South Vietnamese were not going to come to the bargaining table anyways. It didn't take Richard Nixon signaling them, and they weren't going to do it anyways. And in fact, scholars have looked into this and found that the South Vietnamese just weren't going to do that. So yes, Nixon was guilty of playing footsie with the Dragon Lady, with Madame Chennault, and probably shouldn't have been doing all that. He shouldn't have been. But it didn't make that much difference because South Vietnamese wasn't going to give up anyways to get a better deal. So it's not a fake scandal, but it's been exaggerated. The significance of it has been exaggerated.
Because it fits the Nixon personality
Yeah,
narrative. Of course he
yeah,
would have done that. He called Helen Gahagan Douglas the Pink Lady. So why
yeah,
wouldn't he reach out to
yeah.
the South
Even that
Vietnamese
Pink Lady
government?
thing, I don't know if Irv Gelman writes these Nixon books and is
Oh
really
yeah.
really gets into the detail. And Gelman, he's much better at this than I am because my information really comes from him. But even the Pink Lady stuff has been exaggerated. I don't remember the details on this. Gelman does. But in our need to paint Nixon as a monster, we've exaggerated his sins. He had sins, but we've made him worse.
I was going to ask you about that was related to the movie Nixon and in the other conversations I've had with Nixon historians and just general conversation. And that is, and I asked Dwight Chapin this. Dwight Chapin wrote a terrific book
Yeah, he
on
did.
his time with Nixon. He's such a really nice man.
Yeah, he's a sweetheart of a guy. I know him a little bit.
Was Nixon's protests that what the hell am I getting in trouble for? We all have done Dick Tuck. Hell,
Yeah,
Dick Tuck gets mentioned by Pat Buchanan in the Watergate hearings in the summer of 73. And
yeah.
as soon as Buchanan mentions his name, Sam Ervin, the senator in charge of it, starts laughing like he knows what's going on. So how much of Nixon's frustration, exasperation of like, why am I being singled out?
Yeah.
Everybody does everything. How much of that is valid?
Some of it. Dick Tuck, who was the dirty trickster of the Kennedy campaigns. People like to say, Dick Tuck was just innocent. No, I don't think it was so innocent. The Kennedys were better at dirty tricks in 60 than Nixon, and he remembered it. We just mentioned the Kennedys stole the election in 60. How about that for a dirty trick?
Or bringing in Franklin Roosevelt Jr. into West Virginia to obliquely accuse Hubert Humphrey of being a draft dodger.
Yeah, they were, but the fact is, the Kennedy machine, guys like Paul Corbin, were better at dirty tricks than Nixon was in 1960. And Nixon never forgot that. Now, you can say, now, Dick, just because they did all that bad stuff doesn't mean that you should have tried to top them doing bad stuff. That's going to blow up in your face, and it did. But you can understand his bitterness and resentment of those tricky Kennedys who are treated like Galahad by the press. They're
Sure.
a wonderful, noble, everybody's in love with the Kennedys. No, the Kennedys were tricksters, and Nixon was resentful, and he's going to top them. So he did it badly. His tricksters weren't as good as Dick Tuck. Segretti was a fool. The guy doing those dirty tricks
Right.
he was out of over his head, maybe not a fool, but over those pranks didn't really work all that well, and they were misbegotten, and
They weren't needed. They
yeah,
weren't needed. My
yeah.
favorite is Dick Tuck having all the pregnant women with the Nixon the One t-shirts.
Yes,
That's my favorite.
yeah, yeah. Segretti went too far, but as you point out, Nixon was ahead of McGovern by 30 points in the polls.
Yeah.
He just didn't need it.
You were old enough to remember this. Forgive me. I am not. I remember the fall of Saigon. That's in 75. I was born in 67. But I just finished a book and interviewed the author. I don't know if Brian Vandemark.
I know of him. He's a Naval Academy professor who wrote a very good book about heuristics in Vietnam, or assumptions, or foolish assumptions.
His new book is all about Kent State.
Ah,
And I highly recommend it to you. And I can send you the link to the podcast interview we did with him. I didn't really know much about Kent State. The book is marvelous. But how much did, or if it did at all, did the shootings at Kent State on, I think, May 4th, 1970, affect Nixon? Or did they not at all? Because they're always made to be this seminal moment in American history, the shootings. And one of the things that Professor Vandermark makes the point in the book is, yes, the college students were kids. Yes, they shouldn't have been shot, but the guardsmen were kids and
yeah,
they shouldn't have been put in the position where they could have shot.
yeah, yeah. I certainly defer to Vandermark, who I have a great regard because I didn't know about this new book, but I did read his book about Vietnam, and it was brilliant, I thought. Uh, though that whole scene of Nixon at 4 a.m. going to the Lincoln Monument to talk to the kids, it's so unfair because he's painted as this drunken fool because some of the kids made fun of him for wanting to talk about football when we want to talk about serious things. If you actually look at what he said to those kids, it was an honest attempt by a guy to talk to those kids and find out what was on their mind. And the real story is much more, I think, sympathetic to Nixon. It's pathetic that the president is maybe had a drink or two and he's trudging around out there at 4 o'clock in the morning, but it's also a genuine attempt by him to find out what the hell was on their mind and why they're marching on the White House and marching on him. It wasn't nearly, it was clumsy, Nixonian clumsy, but it was a sincere attempt to find out what the kids wanted and to talk to them.
It's one of the true tragedies of Watergate, and there are several. I mean, perhaps the irony is that Nixon was seen as someone who wasn't loyal to his friends. He let everybody take the rap for him, but he then stood by Mitchell, as you stated earlier in the podcast. And if he had let Mitchell hang out to dry or just fired him, things would have been different. But it's one of the tragedies of Watergate, the fact that every time Nixon, the President Nixon or whomever, had a chance to do the right thing, they batted 0-0-0. That they had multiple chances to change the history, change the narrative, do the right thing, and they failed every single time. And to me, greatness in a lot of, and it's not just to me, it's to others. One of the reasons for me that John F. Kennedy is seen as such a phenomenal president is how he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah,
If you
that's
get the
good.
big things,
Yeah,
then
no,
history remembers you favorably.
that missile crisis that was a total screw up by the Kennedy administration. And the Cuban exile CIA plot, they're driven into the sea, hugely embarrassing. But Kennedy brilliantly stands in front of the cameras and says, "Victory has 1,000 fathers,
Mm-hmm.
but defeat is an orphan." That's what they say. But I am
Mm-hmm.
responsible for this. I am responsible for this failure. His approval rating went to 89%.
Yeah.
People were so grateful to have an honest leader who took responsibility for his actions that enhanced his popularity to, I don't think any president's ever been that high since. So there's,
Maybe George H.W. Bush, he was in the 90s, I think, low
yeah,
90s after the
okay,
Persian
okay,
Gulf War. But yeah, your
okay.
point's well taken.
But yeah, and they never learn. Politicians never learn. Instead, they cover up, they deny, they run away from it. It's just so goddamn foolish. It drives me crazy.
Was it Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, said of the French royal family, the Bourbons, they have learned nothing and forgotten nothing.
That's a great line. That describes the American political scene.
We have so much more to talk about, but I've kept Mr. Thomas longer than I said I would. Nixon gets some redemption, famously on Newsweek's cover with "He's Back." He is, to varying degrees, an advisor to subsequent presidents.
Yeah.
He makes a ton of money, eventually writing these books, which are very strong. But one thing I want to specifically ask you about his time from 1974 when he resigns in August and then until he dies. I don't know if it's April of 94, but I know it's 94. Was his sit down with David Frost.
Hmm.
Now, as a journalist, as someone who was super involved in politics and has it basically in his veins, in his DNA, and I mean that as a compliment, what did you think when you watched the Frost interviews with Nixon? I've watched them all on YouTube. I remember them as a kid, but I didn't pay that much attention.
Well,
Was that a smart move on his part?
he let Frost get to him, which was inevitable. And he made that. I think that's in those interviews where Nixon makes this unfortunate remark about if I'm the president, it's legal. Whatever I do is legal, which has now been hung around his neck and is currently an issue in our current politics. Do presidents have immunity to do whatever they want? Recent Supreme Court decision on that point. So Nixon made a big mistake by talking to Frost at all.
But
But
he
I
needed money. He needed money. He
he
wanted to
needed the
set the
money.
record straight.
And so you can see how it happened. I'm generally in favor of people talking to reporters. That's how I made my living.
Sure.
And I can understand why he did it. I approve of why he did it, but Frost over time got under his skin, and Nixon said some stuff that he should not have because he could never tame his demons. He had these unruly things in his head. I talked to a former Colson aide who was good on this. Nixon just often was doing the right thing, but he could not. His intention was to do the right thing, but he had these unruly demons in his head, these bats in his belfry that led him astray again and again. And as you pointed out, at critical moments, he did the wrong thing. And history is unkind to him for that. And I guess that's justified. I've tried to do some Nixon redemption, but I can't get around the fact that he despoiled our system and brought people to not to trust politicians. The ironies are endless. Nixon was a public servant. He devoted his life to public service. But at the end of the day, he hurt public service by lowering the credibility of the presidency and American institutions. It breaks my heart to say that, but it's just true.
And in your book, you do a better than anyone in any other book I've read on Nixon of putting context. Okay, did he have a slush fund in 1952? Okay, but so did Adlai Stevenson, and it was a hell of a lot
bigger one.
much bigger one. Was what, and we didn't really talk much about Pat or his relationship to his family, to whom he was devoted, although he was ferociously cold at times. There was a lot of coverage back then where it says that Nixon president and the first lady weren't very affectionate, and then you make the point, neither were Jackie and John Kennedy, by the way,
right?
That there are all these things with which Nixon gets tarred. But you, as a historian, say, okay, that's true, but look, they're not the only ones, and here's an example.
Right.
How important was that to you to say, to put it all in context? It probably didn't take any energy if you wanted to write this anti-Nixon indictment. That would have been the easy thing to do. But the compliment I can give to your book, the greatest one besides just its readability, is that you went the extra step to say, okay, these things are true, but guess what? Here's Dick Tuck. And yeah, Nixon wasn't having sex with White House maids in the closet or whatever. How important was it to you, is it to you, to put the Nixon's behavior and the condemnations of Nixon and insults in larger context?
Well, there are two things. One is I think I wrote the 13th Nixon book, so I'm not. It's well plowed ground. So I'm trying to say something that's a little bit fresh. But the other is I'm 73 years old. People do a lot of stupid stuff in their lives. I'm sure I have. And it requires context. You have to look at the life in full. You have to look at the whole thing. That is a more realistic view of who we are. We have a lot of bad in us. We have a lot of good in us. That's been true ever since Adam and Eve. That's the reality. We have to accept that. And one thing I don't like about modern political discourse, it's black and white, it's binary. I'm right, you're wrong. I'm morally superior, you're morally deficient. I hate that. I think our public dialogue has been coarsened by this binary black and white, I'm right, you're wrong the thing that's going on now, enhanced by social media, horribly driven by social media. And so anything I can do to inject some shades of gray, that's what I want to do.
We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. Evan Thomas, are you ready?
I'm ready.
What was your first job?
My first real job was as a reporter for the Bergen Record, covering some counties in northern New Jersey.
What was your first concert?
My first concert was unfortunately watching, I think, James Taylor high on heroin, very nodding off concert at Princeton University when I was down there for a football game, 1970.
You were down there in Princeton when Mitch Daniels was down there, class of 71, I believe.
I guess he probably went to that concert.
His first concert, I can tell you, was Love and Spoonful and the Association.
Oh, great. A better concert.
Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
All the King's Men, sorry, by Robert Penn Warren, the greatest political novel and a novel about life ever written.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh boy, there's a lot to choose from there. I would say Lincoln's second inaugural.
Did you read Edward Alcorn's book about that?
I didn't. I should. There are a lot of the Lincoln books. I'm late to Lincoln. I'm a late in life Lincoln discoverer. I'm just getting into him now.
I'll send you the link to it. He writes about how Lincoln's second inaugural was basically a religious referring very Old Testament that, hey, we've allowed slavery to grow and flourish, and this is our punishment. The Civil War is our punishment. He came on the podcast to talk about it. It was very enlightening. How many books I've read on Lincoln? Maybe 80. I never saw all of it that way that he did.
Yeah, no, but the religious aspect interests me greatly.
Last question, and this is something that you've done, so maybe you can tell me with whom you've done it. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Living today.
I know you've sat down with some amazing people.
Yeah, frankly, there are two of them, my friends, John Meacham and Walter Isaacson. I have sat down and had dinner with them.
And I would love to have them on.
Fascinating.
I would love to have them on the podcast.
Endlessly interesting. They're not politicians, they're not statesmen, but boy, do they know their history, and they understand human nature, and they're equally brilliant in their own way.
Is becoming a historian maybe a natural, or not transforming, but are matriculating to writing history books, a natural path for journalists? Because there are so many who are doing what you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. It's just an extension of what we do in our day job, or was for me. I work for news magazines where it was a group process. I like that. It worked very well, but I like to be able to do things on my own, and also to go back and find out what really happened. We were in the moment trying to say what's happening now and trying to what's going to happen next week. I like this idea. What actually did happen?
Yeah.
And it's often not what you thought at the time.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Evan Thomas. He has written several books, including one that I really enjoyed, I must say. And if you ever want to talk about it, I would be completely down. And that would be Ike's Bluff. I read it a couple of years ago. President Eisenhower's secret battle to save the world. But today we discussed his effort, Being Nixon, a Man Divided. Mr. Thomas, I have kept you longer than I promised I would. I'm very sorry, but I'm fascinated by your book and very, very grateful for your conversation today.
I enjoyed it. We could have gone on for another couple hours. Thanks, Robert.
I hope you had fun.
I did.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.